Coming, everyone. I have perhaps the unenviable task of trying to compress what Steve Farber and Eric Miller each teach different courses on transportation, land use connection, and to try to take all this content into 20 minutes is not an easy task at all. But a little bit of background on the project itself is it's an integrated approach to transit system evolution, and it's funded by SSHRC's, the SSHRC's knowledge synthesis grants, which I understand were prepared to, in partnership with Infrastructure Canada, to try to have academics synthesize the current state of knowledge about key issues impacting the way we think about public transit in Canadian communities today and going forward, to sort of inform policy and planning for the next decade or so. And our particular project, we've broken it into 3 modules. We have the first module is what we're working on today. It's about revisiting sort of the core works that inform the way that we as academics think about how transportation and land use are connected in cities, and the role that transportation plays in shaping land use and vice versa. So revisiting sort of those core theories that inform the way we think about this. And from that point, we're going to have a second workshop and a third workshop for the third module as well. But the next one we're working on after this is about understanding the role of new transportation technologies and trends. So technologies like potentially autonomous vehicles, e-scooters, all sorts of things, their role in reducing transportation costs potentially, and trends like COVID on how it's changing travel patterns and how it's affecting that system that we've set up in module 1. And then module 3 is about reinterpreting this transportation land use connection going forward, updating these core theories and works and how to guide the way we think about transportation and land use in Canadian cities. The team, I think pretty much everyone is online today. This is the team. We're a really strong team across several different universities, and just say hi to them. You'll see them all in your breakout groups. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to keep going. So revisiting this transportation land use connection. The core of it to me is that I come from an academic background. I'm assistant professor in human geography at UTSC. Previously was at McMaster University and then Hong Kong in between those two, working in transportation and land use issues. And planners, policymakers, academics, a huge swath of the general public, I find, argues in favor of greater integration of transportation and land use planning. Things like transit-oriented development. If we're going to build an LRT line, let's make sure we have the transit-oriented development policies in place to support that transit investment with proper land use planning supports. But just to kind of take a step back a little bit, this is a great opportunity for us as the project team to, again, just take a step back and think about what is this relationship between transportation and land use in theory, because I think we've got the theory part figured out pretty well, but how does this theory translate to practice, like the current state of practice? And that's why we're really excited to have this diverse group of stakeholders join us today to talk about these issues, give us a little bit more insight into what happens on the ground. So, do transport investments shape cities, and vice versa is sort of the overarching question guiding this today. But let's go to those theories. So I think the fundamental way to start about all of this always comes back to these urban economic models of the city. And the core of all of this, it really comes back to the work of William Alonso, and it's been extended many times since. And again, don't grade me on this, my colleagues. I just got to give a high-level overview of sort of the dynamics of all of this. So I'm going to leave out a lot of detail, but transportation costs are the causal mechanism in the way we understand the development and the use of urban land in cities. And it comes from all sorts of, like von Thunen's model of agriculture and things like this, but what we have is a monocentric city that has a central business district. This is half of a circle, after which it's hypothesized you'd see manufacturing uses and then residential uses followed by agriculture uses as distance from that central business district increases. What this model is doing is Alonso is looking at cities and trying to predict, why do we see tall towers in the central part of cities that are full of retail and office firms, and largely see suburban developments out at the urban fringe. And eventually those suburban developments stop and you get agricultural land uses. And this is many, many decades ago, and you would see a tight clustering of manufacturing uses around that central business district. This model is essentially trying to put a market price on centrality, on trying to be in the middle of a city. And the thinking was, these different broad land use functions, they bid different prices for land closer to the city center because they get benefits from being closer to the city center. So retail and office uses like to be tightly clustered together, and tall office towers close to the city center just because they like agglomeration, and that sort of compression has the most access to the largest market of people. And residential uses like to be farther away from the core. And I'm going to sort of go high level on this, but we see higher land prices that encourage more intense land use in the central part of cities, and lower density development at the urban fringe. So this is population density should probably peak around these rings. Overall urban density, I suppose you'd probably expect to go something like this, but you just see this break in land uses in old cities at the turn of the previous century. And for people specifically, and this makes the most sense still for people, is that what it comes down to for individuals and households is that you want to balance your access to the city, your commuting costs to reach the city, with a living area, according to this model, so that you would end up in some sort of trade-off where living closer to the city center, you would live in a smaller apartment, but you'd have greater accessibility, lower transportation costs to the amenities of the city, versus living in a suburban house that's very large out at the urban fringe. You have higher transportation costs because you have to travel longer and a greater distance to get to your job in the urban core, but you have traded that commuting cost off for a larger house and more living space and a bigger piece of land. That's been extended many times since this general idea to, what if instead of a monocentric city, we had polycentric cities with many subcenters, like say downtown Toronto, Mississauga. You keep going further into Peel region and getting further little subcenters. What you should see, according to this theory, is sort of this kind of waves in densities around the centers in terms of where people live and they're commuting to the different main center population, the main center, the subcenters, et cetera, like that. And with these transportation costs being smallest in the urban centers, again, this is an old theory. You should see, say, commercial and back office use peaking at these little subcenters, commercial use at the subcenters, followed by potentially some manufacturing around them, and then surrounded by residential uses. This is a really broad theory, and it did a pretty good job, in my opinion, my unqualified opinion, but of explaining the way cities used to look. Particularly older cities like Chicago or even Toronto, you do see this peaking of central business district activities. You had a strong manufacturing core around that, followed by large swaths of residential use in more distant zones from the central business district. But this is what it really all comes down to for our purposes today, is everything in the Alonso, Muth, Mills, et cetera, all these urban economic models, it comes down to transportation costs. Transportation costs define land use types, the price of land, and the trade-offs people are making to live in different bundles of land use and transportation costs. So, but a different way of putting that transportation cost is accessibility. And accessibility is, it's the ease with which you as an individual from a given origin can reach destinations that you value within the city using the transportation network. So from your house, for example, how many destinations can you reach using the transportation network across the city? And if, just in a broad sense, this New Yorker title, front page, you get a low accessibility area like this because there's just not that many amenities around. There's not that much transportation infrastructure versus clearly a high accessibility urban context that has a subway underneath the street potentially. There's streets, there's lots of tall towers with housing different amenities, housing different land uses. It's just accessibility is the way we think about transportation costs and land use altogether. So in this case, if transportation costs between an origin and a destination become cheaper, say in terms of time or monetary or other costs, accessibility should increase. So say we build a subway line, accessibility should increase. If we build a highway, accessibility to things should increase. These high costs lead to less potential for interaction. If there's really high congestion on a highway, you would expect less potential for interaction with the rest of the city because accessibility has declined in that case. But lower transportation costs just in general should lead to what we call a locational advantage, that these transportation cost savings you see at a particular location in a city should be capitalized into the price of land, and higher priced land should be utilized more intensively. We should have taller towers on that land. And that's just sort of how the model cascades to predict the form of cities that we see around us. But all of that said, we just had to cover Alonso before we speak in more general ways. It is an integrated urban system that transportation and land use are connected to each other, but that should be an arrow. they're connected through accessibility. And so transportation investments can affect the accessibility to things. That accessibility is connecting people to different land uses using the transportation network. And then the left-hand side of this is, once you have that transportation and land use system in place that provides accessibility, we should see people behave in particular ways through their activity patterns. This is an old graph I took from Genevieve Giuliano's book. The arrows imply some sort of causality, but it's really sort of bidirectional relationships here between transportation that provides accessibility to different land uses that provide accessibility through the transportation network, and just a nice system where changing one thing affects the other things. But the key takeaways here that I want to flavor our discussion throughout this workshop is really that accessibility is one of the key determinants of the value of the land and the way it's used and the intensity of that development on that land. According to the urban economic models that underpin our thinking, people and firms are making either implicit or explicit trade-offs when they select a location. So if you're buying a house, you have to make trade-offs between your accessibility to things that you value, say your workplace, your partner's workplace, the location of your children's schools, all these sorts of things, and try to find some optimal location that has good accessibility to those things. And then from there, you could pick, say, I want to have really high accessibility and low transportation costs to those things, or we accept a longer commute to have more living space, in theory, out at the urban fringe or something. So higher accessibility locations in a city should be higher cost, but they should also have higher density development. And lower accessibility locations should have cheaper housing or cheaper development per square foot or meter squared, but higher transportation costs to things. So, okay, all that out of the way. How does this transportation land use framework translate to practice? And that really is the open question here. So in practice then, particularly for public transit, what have we seen in the last several decades since this the urban system way of thinking was established? Is that for public transit in particular, the evidence of how public transit investments can affect land use on their own has generally been mixed. And there was a flurry of research in the 1970s and 1980s about reflecting on investments in, say, heavy rail transit, like the Bay Area Rapid Transit Network, where many, many millions of, potentially billions of dollars were spent on putting in subway systems. And then what ended up happening to the land use? Land use has never really changed around any of the stations. So transit was built, but development didn't really come. And then that led to a lot of reflection on why. And it's really cleared up our thinking in a lot of ways of transit is just one factor among many in promoting land development in a region. And at a high level, transit, you should think about it as it doesn't really lead to new growth in development, but rather that public transit investments like a rapid transit line, at their best, can refocus development around that corridor if it has the right policy and planning supports on the land use side. So those early failures led to transit-oriented development as a theory and practice of explicitly promoting higher density, mixed use, pedestrian-friendly development around transit stations through supportive planning and policy, unlocking density bonuses, allowing mixing of uses within walking distance of transit stations to try to at least to try to promote that land use change around the transit stations that we would have expected to see based on these the urban economic models. But even there, TOD itself is just, and this is a crazy graph to show in a quick presentation, but the point is, even if you have the improvement in accessibility, so we build a new rapid transit line that improves accessibility, we have complementary TOD planning and policy, you still might not see land use change around rapid transit stations because you've got all these other factors at play that determine whether or not development is a good investment for developers, like regional growth, the characteristics of the station areas, social characteristics, is there available land, and on and on and on. Is just accessibility and transportation costs are a key part of the urban economic models, but in reality, it's a much messier picture. And even TOD planning and policy is still just one of these 6 characteristics that promote development.
Chris, wrapping up within 10 minutes, please.
Yeah, of course. What's happened since is we've seen since these urban economic models were proposed as well, we've seen a really strong decline in transportation costs in cities. So transport costs before the 1900s this is from Edward Glaser, were enormously high because roads and rail were rare. People tended to move goods and themselves by foot or by water or public transport. These high transportation costs led to really high density cities, which provided a strong benefit, a strong relative accessibility benefit for public transit. But throughout the 1900s and even into today, we've got significant changes brought on by engines that were able to propel people and goods over much longer distances through better and better machines, really. And the decline in transportation costs is almost staggering in a way. Of gone from 18.5 cents to move a ton of goods 1 mile in the US, they estimated, which was about 9% of GDP. Today, the cost in terms of writing was at 2004, they published this paper, but down to 2.3 cents, leading the authors to conclude that moving goods has now essentially become costless. And if transportation costs have become essentially free in a lot of ways, particularly for goods, they're arguing, would we see cities flatten? Because again, if transportation costs are defining the intensity and use of land, are we going to see a flattening of cities in that case? Because moving things, geography is now not an impediment to anything. Well, the rapid decline in the cost of moving goods has let cities change functions. It's not so much we have that inner manufacturing ring anymore. Manufacturing can be located, we see the sprawl of manufacturing and other uses around the GTHA. But cities still exist. We still have tall towers downtown. People are still commuting to these towers. So what's still happening is that moving people is not free. While cars have simplified the movement for a lot of people, car infrastructure is essentially ubiquitous across North America and increasingly most of the world. It still remains a large proportion of household transportation costs in general, because you have to buy the car and maintain it and fuel it. Congestion and delay are also huge costs. And cities themselves are still magnets of agglomeration, because consider something like information and communication technologies that, just like the internal combustion engine, in theory, they should allow us to overcome geography in the way we share knowledge and information. And we've seen that during the pandemic. We can share information over long distances because we all get together on Zoom. But one of the arguments made by Merrick Gertler, who now president of the U of T, is that indeed information, you can share information through information and communication technologies pretty easily, but trying to share tacit knowledge, which is more intangible sharing of knowledge, requires face-to-face contact, and it requires experience to develop. And the hypothesis is that why we still have office towers and why we still see banks and all these other firms locating in the central core of cities is because they like to get together to share knowledge face-to-face, and sharing knowledge can't be accommodated through ICTs. So because we still like to get together face-to-face for innovative activities, there's still an agglomeration effect. There's still a pull that's keeping people in cities. So people moving costs are not declining in cities. And if anything, they've increased over the last few decades, which is good for public transit. We also have an extension of the theories. We have land value uplift, where transportation infrastructure plays a key role in transportation costs. So picture we build a rapid transit line, and each of these are now transit stations in this graph. What you should see is, because the transit stations have fixed access points, or even highways, they have fixed access points, you should see transportation costs decline and sort of smooth away around those access points. And in theory, as distance increases, that accessibility should decrease. And a consequence of that is land prices should also decrease as you move further away from these access points, and population densities should peak around those access points. But there's more than 100 studies. I did this part of my PhD thesis, but hundreds of studies have been testing this theory in practice in different cities around the world. I'm just going to close my window. We've got road construction outside. And then an extension of land value uplift is land value capture of, okay, if we build transportation infrastructure, can we recapture some of those land value benefits through different policy mechanisms? And old streetcar cities were famous for this. So many early streetcar networks built by property developers that knew that if they extended the streetcar to this plot of land, they can sell houses on that land for significantly more money than they would have otherwise. Hong Kong is still a great example of that. The transit operator is essentially a property developer that builds huge, high mixed-use towers around transit stations and recaptures all of that value that they afford through the transportation investment. But the flip side of that coin is, and we've seen increasing attention to this in the academic literature, is transit-induced gentrification and displacement of, if and it has been shown in a lot of cases that rapid transit investments or just investments in public transit can increase property values because they've increased accessibility to different land parcels. If we see that upward pressure on land and housing values, we may also be seeing high-income residents outbid low-income residents for access to this new amenity, leading to the most transit-dependent segments of the population being displaced from the most accessible locations, which kind of forms this a paradox in the investment of new transit systems, that the populations that could benefit the most from transit may be getting priced out of the transit station areas. So this is, again, a bit of a nascent research area, but some papers have shown that people moving into transit station areas tend to be wealthier and higher educated and younger. But it actually remains an open question whether they are displacing current residents. A lot of the research that I've been reading for this review hasn't been able to find an effect. And they argue more research is needed. So I hope that does sort of set the underlying theories and the fundamentals that inform the way we think about it. And I just wanted to set the stage for our discussion really quickly through Toronto, is that we do have a really tall, dense, mixed-use urban core, just as you might expect from, say, a monocentric model. But it's a polycentric urban region, but still a very strong urban core, peaking of population and employment densities in that core relative to the rest of the region. We have a great transit network that provides high levels of accessibility to that job center, particularly for the old city of Toronto. As you might expect, through the Alonzo model, people do sort of trade off between transportation costs and housing costs in practice, although it's not perfect. In the Alonzo model, it would be perfect, where you're perfectly balancing transportation and housing costs, but commuting costs are offsetting some of those mortgage savings we see in different regions around different parts of the GTHA region. The decline in transportation costs did lead to a lot of urban growth and spatial expansion over the past several decades. The Toronto region has grown outwards significantly to the point where we put a greenbelt cap on that growth. But on the other hand, we've also got really crazy downtown, not just downtown, really crazy levels of high density growth around different parts of the city and region, with the most cranes in North America by far at some points in time. And then on the other side of that, we have a housing affordability crisis that has been a big topic of this federal election, where Toronto and now Hamilton are very increasingly unaffordable regions for people to live. And on the other side of that, some significant investments in rapid transit infrastructure ongoing in the region, light rail around different parts of the province, the Ontario line, different extensions being considered. So there's a lot happening. And while we haven't dug into the data to examine gentrification and displacement, this is from Hamilton. One of the areas we do see displacement is through the buying of property to create the transit lines. So in the Hamilton's case, where the project has been derailed a few times, but Metrolinx had already bought a lot of property, there is an issue of people being displaced along the transit line just through the construction itself, not necessarily the gentrification effects, which we haven't investigated. And just quickly, if you can indulge me, Judy, this is something I always found fascinating, is that we do have a strong history of land value capture in Toronto, where in constructing the first chunk of the Yonge subway, the TTC itself, doing cut and cover construction, purchased significant amounts of land along that first transit corridor beneath, and then leased out that land by the TTC. So analysts at the time in the 1960s and 70s were hailing Toronto as its example of how transit agencies can capitalize on their land uses and land purchases by leasing and selling that land in an aggressive way. So maybe will we see a return to that? So wrapping up, the precise nature of this land use transportation connection has long been elusive. It continues to be elusive, but now we just have some new elements to add to the equation of, say, innovations in transportation technologies, COVID-related changes to home and workplace locations, travel patterns, preferences toward local and multimodal travel, like, say, the growth of the 15-minute city concept. And I hope to really learn something from your experiences here around these 5 questions that we posed for our discussions. Is that, first one, is the transportation land use connection strong enough for public transit alone to affect land use change, or vice versa? Are the connections between public transit and land use strengthening or weakening? And will public transit investments be effective in shaping Canadian communities post-COVID? Does transit create this locational advantage in real estate prices in practice? And is there a real role for land value capture for transit projects in Canada? How can the land use benefits of public transit projects be balanced against achieving social outcomes, such as minimizing displacement and promoting affordable housing? And what role will new mobility technologies play in shaping this transportation land use connection post-COVID in Canadian communities?